Give me a freaking break. The vocals undeniably belong to Melania Trump, broadcast loudly within a congressional committee space. 3 million citizens listened as the nation's former First Lady directed those remarks at undocumented youth isolated from their guardians. Jasmine Crockett held her peace until the playback finished, proceeding to unseal a document file. The materials within proved even more catastrophic than the audio itself. Melania maintained her signature poise, a rigidly erect spine, an even chin, and hands quietly clasped on her thighs, the exact bearing of an individual photographed thousands of times, fully aware that a motionless physique betrays almost nothing. Her expression remained totally vacant, devoid of smiles, frowns, or any discernible emotion. It was the identical mask she donned for diplomatic banquets, media scrums, and memorial services alike. This very visage had served as her trademark for 2 decades. Beside her, her legal counsel sat unusually near, breaching the typical distance maintained by witness attorneys. He was positioned close enough to murmur without shifting and close enough to graze her sleeve. Crockett unfastened hip in Mrs. Trump, on the 19th of January, 2025, the eve of your husband's swearing in, you published a message on Truth Social declaring the official Melania meme is live. You can buy $Melania now. She displayed a blown-up image of the digital update. It featured Melania's profile, her exact phrasing, and the verification badge. In a mere 24 hours, the cryptocurrency skyrocketed by 12,000%. Within a quarter of a year, it plummeted, shedding 98% of its worth. Everyday citizens who purchased the asset simply because the First Lady endorsed it, educators, pensioners, and modest traders were financially decimated. Crockett placed the printed evidence onto the platform. Did you author this message, Mrs. Trump? The attorney visibly tilted forward, shrinking the already minimal gap. Mrs. Trump's social networking platforms are overseen by. I directed my inquiry to Mrs. Trump, not her legal representation, Crockett interjected, locking eyes with Melania. The entire chamber focused their gaze upon her. 3 million viewers stared at Melania, anticipating the First Lady's utterance. I was aware of the post, just 6 hushed, distinctly accented words. It was the absolute bare minimum that could legally be considered a reply. Her fingers stayed intertwined, her back stayed completely upright, and her countenance stayed blank. The facade remained intact. You were aware. I appreciate that, Mrs. Trump. Now, I possess a blockchain tracking report. The Congresswoman elevated a sheet filled with data charts, digital wallet coordinates, and transfer maps. This originates from Bubble Maps, an investigative blockchain enterprise. Upon release, roughly 90% of the Melania tokens were consolidated within one solitary wallet. 90%, a single digital wallet. She laid the paper upon the dais right next to the Truth Social printout. And the Financial Times documented that 24 distinct wallets acquired $2.6 million in Melania tokens, merely moments prior to your Truth Social announcement. Moments, Mrs. Trump. And they liquidated those assets in the subsequent days for roughly $100 million. Melania's hands stirred. Her right hand glided atop her left in a subtle repositioning. It was an involuntary adjustment from someone whose extremities had been locked in place and whose physiology subconsciously demanded a shift. On the zoomed-in broadcast, it marked the initial physical alteration Melania Trump had exhibited since taking her seat. $100 million in monetary gains reaped by wallets that purchased just minutes before you broadcasted your cryptocurrency on your personal feed. Crockett then revealed another piece of evidence, this one bearing official government formatting. This is the mandatory filing for top-tier officials. It is your financial disclosure supplement, Mrs. Trump, submitted to the White House Ethics Bureau. My committee secured this via subpoena. She recited at a deliberate pace. utilizing the Cadence attorneys reserved for critical figures. January 22nd, 2025, 3 days post-launch, an electronic transfer from Melania Meme LLC directly into your private trust. $8, 3 millions. Melania's chin, perfectly horizontal since her arrival, faltered. It dipped by a single degree, not a slump, but a micro-reaction. It was the flinch of a chin, acknowledging a familiar figure, not hearing it initially, but hearing it broadcast to the globe. February 14th, a secondary transfer, $9.1 million. March 2nd, a tertiary transfer. $7.3 million. She positioned the disclosure document on the table. 3 specific dates, 3 massive transfers, 3 sums that equate to a single grand total, $24.7 million funneled from the corporation that minted the coin directly into your private trust, all while the asset evaporated 98% of its valuation. All while amateur investors, regular citizens who invested strictly because the First Lady of the United States instructed them to lost entirely everything. The attorney leaned closer, murmuring. Melania's right hand levitated a fraction of an inch from her lap before dropping back. It was the stifled impulse of a physique yearning to react, suppressed by 2 decades of rigorous conditioning that screamed, refrain. The discipline of relentless paparazzi. Never allow them to witness your distress. Mrs. Trump, the class action lawsuit filed in the Southern District of New York in October 2025 asserts your token operated as a pump and dump fraud, utilizing you as the glamorous facade for an illicit operation. Your legal team countered by stating you would never have consented to the utilization of your identity had you been aware of the reality. She aligned the lawsuit document parallel to the financial disclosure, ensuring the papers physically met. Your Truth Social update explicitly called it the official Melania meme. Your financial records indicate $24.7 million in cash transfers. And your legal defense insists you were oblivious. Mrs. Trump, if you were oblivious to who deposited $24.7 million into your trust, and if you were fully aware, why did you encourage the American populace to purchase an asset engineered to implode? Melania offered no retort. Her counsel refrained from leaning. A profound quiet enveloped the room, distinct from the typical lulls of prior inquiries. This wasn't the quiet of an individual struggling for vocabulary, nor the quiet of an exhausted speaker. This was the absolute stillness of a woman who had monetized wordlessness, who had forged an empire on the capacity to occupy a space in utter silence. Yet, occupying this specific space in silence now appeared overwhelmingly like an admission of guilt. Crockett refrained from pushing harder. She allowed the silence to resonate. A dozen years of interrogating witnesses had taught her that a vacuum following a piercing inquiry speaks louder than any spoken defense. The accusation hovered. The financial records rested on the dais. The blockchain tracking sat adjacent to it. And the nation's first lady sat frozen in her seat, spine aligned, features blank, fingers interlaced, offering zero rebuttal. Mrs. Trump, I wish to share a story about a constituent who acquired your token, a resident of my district whom I will refer to as Patricia. She is a 8-year-old retired postal employee. She viewed your Truth Social update. The official Melania meme is live. You can buy dollar Melania now. She invested her money, $3,200, her entire life savings. Not a massive treasury, but her complete financial safety net. Melania's gaze, previously locked on an indistinct point in the distance the void witnesses stare into to avoid acknowledging their interrogator, or the evidence dropped a fraction. Not toward the table, but into the vacant space, separating her from the legislator narrating Patricia's plight. Patricia confided in me that she invested solely because the First Lady recommended it. Not some crypto promoter, not a faceless web profile. The First Lady of the United States, utilizing her verified official channel. Patricia assumed that if the First Lady suggested a purchase, it was guaranteed to be secure. It proved completely unsecure, Mrs. Trump. Patricia's $3,200 investment is currently valued at $64. She suffered a 98% loss, while your private trust absorbed $24.7 million. Patricia lacks the resources to retain legal counsel. She cannot participate in a class action lawsuit because she lacks the digital literacy to do so. She is currently employed part-time at a local supermarket because her nest egg has vanished, all because the First Lady advised her to invest. Melania's jaw clenched. This was not the rehearsed tightening of a statesman formulating a rebuttal. It was the reflexive clenching of an individual confronted with harsh specifics, a distinct name, a specific age, a precise financial loss, and a supermarket, job details that mutated an ambiguous $24.7 million into a living victim. Patricia wasn't physically present, yet Patricia's squandered $3,200, practically materialized on the dais, lingering in the void between the forensic blockchain evidence and the ethics disclosure, mapping the exact route from Patricia's depleted account to Melania's enriched trust. Mrs. Trump, the web portal for your token, categorized it as being intended strictly for collection and amusement purposes. Not an economic vehicle, not fiscal guidance, merely amusement. $3,200 drained from a retired postal worker's reserve. Amusement. She flipped to a fresh page. Mrs. Trump, let us discuss a specific article of clothing. Crockett elevated an image. The infamous AP snapshot of Melania ascending an aircraft staircase, the rear of an olive-colored coat bearing stark white lettering. I really don't care. Do you? You draped yourself in this garment to tour a holding facility, sheltering migrant youth who had been forcibly removed from their guardians under your husband's zero-tolerance directive. Adolescents confined in enclosures, infants stripped from their maternal figures. She gently placed the image on the table. I wish to present a communication drafted by your personnel the preceding day. She produced an email thread bearing the official East Wing crest acquired through legal compulsion. This constitutes an internal dispatch dated June 20th, 2018. It spans from your Director of Communications to your personal aide. She recited, strongly caution against this. The visual implications are disastrous. Recommend a monochromatic overcoat. She turned the sheet. And the response issued by your direct assistant. Mrs. Trump has chosen the jacket. The verdict is absolute. Melania's posture, impeccably rigid since her arrival, the trademark silhouette cultivated over 2 decades yielded. It did not slouch, but it shifted. A subtle horizontal translation as a single spinal joint realigned against the upholstery. It was the physical reaction of a frame sustaining flawless bearing that suddenly processes damaging intel, her own team's warnings, and her own stubborn override of those warnings, demanding a new defensive posture. The verdict is absolute. Your aides implored you to discard it, deemed the optics disastrous, yet you wore it regardless. That does not constitute a blunder, Mrs. Trump. That constitutes a deliberate decision. Furthermore, I possess an additional file. She brandished a Department of Homeland Security executive summary. This is a DHS intelligence document distributed to the East Wing on June 1st, 2018, a full 3 weeks prior to the jacket incident. The subject line reads, Zero Tolerance Policy Implementation, Family Unit Separation Statistics, Mrs. Trump, you professed to ABC News that the family separation mandate caught you completely off guard. You claimed total ignorance. She struck the document with her finger. The opening phrase, which I shall recite, states, under the zero tolerance framework, approximately 2,300 minors have been dislocated from their guardians at the southern boundary. The very first line within a 3-page dossier provided to your staff 3 weeks before you modeled a code stating, I really don't care to inspect those exact minors. You were not caught off guard, Mrs. Trump. You were given a comprehensive briefing 3 weeks prior, complete with the figure of 2,300. The legal counsel parted his lips. The First Lady is inundated with hundreds of informational dossiers and cannot possibly be held accountable for. The email header explicitly states, family unit separation. Counselor, Crockett interrupted. 3 explicit terms right in the subject header. One does not need to consume 3 pages to comprehend the definition of family unit separation. One merely needs to read the title. Crockett retrieved her mobile device, rested it upon the table, and hit play. An audio clip resonated throughout the chamber. It wasn't the voice of the Congresswoman or the attorneys. It was Melania Trump's vocals. The inflection was undeniable. It was the clandestine recording captured by Winston Wolkoff. Give me a fucking break. Were they saying anything when Obama did that? The clip ran for a dozen seconds. Crockett refused to interrupt it. She allowed it to play uninterrupted. 12 uninterrupted seconds of the First Lady ranting about ripped-apart families, echoing in a space where the DHS intelligence, the staff communications, and the infamous jacket photo already populated the evidentiary table. The playback ceased, and the chamber plummeted into silence. It was not the standard bureaucratic lull between inquiries. It was the visceral human quiet that descends when intimately cruel remarks are suddenly aired in a public forum. As 200 attendees and 3 million remote watchers simultaneously digested the vast chasm between public persona and private reality, an observer in the audience, a 60-something woman wearing a gray suit, flattened her palm against her chest. She wasn't grabbing, she was pressing. It was the physical manifestation of a nervous system reacting to a horror the brain was still trying to parse. That is your vocalization, Mrs. Trump, captured by your elite advisor, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, discussing the 2,300 minors detached from their guardians at the southern frontier. Give me a fucking break. She allowed the profanity to hang in the air for a second iteration. The initial delivery was designed for pure shock value. The subsequent delivery cemented it as evidentiary record. For the citizens watching at home, the First Lady of the United States uttered those exact phrases regarding adolescents locked in holding pens, regarding infants resting on cement surfaces wrapped in aluminum blankets, regarding mothers listening to their offspring weep through the walls without the ability to comfort them. Give me a fucking break. That is her summarized opinion of their plight. Melania's features completely immobile since her entrance. The polished product, the carefully curated brand twitched. The muscular ring surrounding her eyes narrowed. The orbicularis oculi contracted, bunching the flesh under her lower lashes. It was neither a flutter nor a squint, but a tense compression. It was the portrait of a subject whose apathetic armor had finally been pierced, not by external allegations, but by her own captured voice echoing back at her within a crowded hall, exposing remarks she had uttered in confidence to a companion who subsequently turned on her. Her hands assumed a new configuration, their third distinct posture of the session. Her right palm clamped over her left. It wasn't a soft embrace. She was clutching so fiercely her joints blanched, not from dropping temperatures, but because her anatomy required a physical outlet for the surging emotional distress. The 2 decades of conditioning that dictated her every public move screamed that the face must never reveal weakness. Consequently, her extremities absorbed the shock. Her expression was forbidden to telegraph, turning her knuckles bone white. I am introducing Be Best. That served as your cornerstone initiative, Mrs. Trump, focusing on anti-cyberbullying and safeguarding youth on the internet. You initiated this program in May of 2018. She produced the official Be Best promotional material, a single month prior to the jacket incident, a single month before you declared, "Give me a fucking break." She situated the pamphlet beside the coat picture, next to the DHS intelligence file, the email thread, and the Wolkoff audio transcript. The platform was gathering evidence in the precise manner a district attorney's desk accumulates proof, each subsequent file adding compounding pressure, each one magnifying the severity of the last. You debuted Be Best to Protect Youth in May. In June 2000, 300 youth were forcefully removed from their guardians. Your staff received advance notice 3 weeks prior. Your personnel pleaded, "Do not don the coat." You donned it regardless. And when questioned about the suffering minors, your retort was, "Give me a fucking break." That does not embody being best, Mrs. Trump. That hardly even qualifies as being present. Mrs. Trump, I intend to display 2 separate files simultaneously. She hoisted both items, gripping one in each hand, akin to an educator contrasting 2 identical essays. On the left, Net Cetera, Chatting with Kids About Being Online, published by the Federal Trade Commission in 2014 during the Obama tenure. On the right, Be Best, issued in 2018, bearing your moniker. She aligned them adjacently on the table. The borders connected, the title pages oriented toward the gallery. Distinct emblems, distinct hues, distinct titles, yet identical substance. Mrs. Trump, I will recite passages from both manuals concurrently, page for page, and I implore the viewing public to spot any discrepancy. She flipped both booklets to their initial page. FTC 2014. Talking with kids about being online is no different than talking to them about things that happen offline. Be Best 2018. Talking with kids about being online is no different than talking to them about things that happen offline. She advanced to the third page. FTC. Even before your child can read, you can begin teaching about safe habits online. Be Best. Even before your child can read, you can begin teaching about safe habits online. She progressed to the 7th page. FTC. Let your child know that you're always open to questions. Be Best. Let your child know that you're always open to questions. She shut both manuals and placed them down. 23 pages, Mrs. Trump. I sampled 3. Each one is a carbon copy, verbatim, punctuation for punctuation, clause for clause. The solitary variance between the government's FTC manual and your Be Best manual is the signature on the jacket. She then produced an internal revision log, procured via legal mandate. This represents your press office's revision history. The log that details the editing process when your team formulated Be Best. She analyzed the log. Page 1. The original FTC document states, Federal Trade Commission. Your alteration swapped it with First Lady Melania Trump. Page 3. The FTC banner is deleted. Your banner is inserted. Page 7. The FTC insignia is erased. The Be Best insignia is superimposed. Page 12. The FTC outreach details are scrubbed. The East Wing coordinates are substituted. Page 19. The FTC legal waiver is struck. Be Best marketing is plastered over it. She lowered the revision log. 5 superficial modifications across 23 pages. All 5 encompass the exact same behavior, erasing another creator's identity and stamping yours in its place. Not a single phrase was fundamentally altered. Not a single section was conceptually overhauled. Not a single unique perspective was infused. That does not constitute editing, Mrs. Trump. That constitutes a find and replace command, the most rudimentary operation on a word processor. Your personnel accessed another author's work, executed Control-H, swapped FTC with Melania Trump, and christened it a policy platform. Melania's spinal alignment, which had already yielded 1 vertebrae during the jacket confrontation, yielded once more. A subsequent joint surrendered, pushing her exemplary posture further from its flawless origin. The backbone that had formerly resembled a rigid pole was now adopting a visible arc, not quite a collapse, but a distinct bowing. It was the structural response of an organism buckling under a fresh burden. The psychological burden of listening to her defining legacy reduced to a mere keyboard shortcut. And this represents the second instance. She brought up 2 more sheets of paper mirroring the pamphlet comparison. Your address at the 2016 Republican National Convention contrasted against Michelle Obama's address at the 2008 Democratic National Convention. She read alternating segments, one from Melania, one from Michelle. The identical flow, the identical pacing, the identical vocabulary. Michelle Obama, 2008. We want our children and all children in this nation to know that the only limit to the height of your achievements is the reach of your dreams and your willingness to work for them. Melania Trump, 2016. We want our children in this nation to know that the only limit to your achievements is the strength of your dreams and your willingness to work for them. She held both transcripts close to the lens for undeniable proof. It was the exact same phrasing. Only two terms were swapped, height transformed to limit, and reach mutated to strength. Out of 23 words, 21 were indistinguishable. Your aide, Meredith McIver, openly confessed on the official record that she appropriated fragments of the rhetoric deployed by Mrs. Obama. Your administration covertly scrubbed the Be Best portal after journalists detected the plagiarized FTC content, two separate occasions, Mrs. Trump. The convention address in 2016 and the policy booklet in 2018, 2 times exposed. 2 times conceded, 2 times utilizing someone else's intellect with your brand slapped across it. She rested both transcripts upon the table. Mrs. Trump, I am a trained attorney. I drafted every single legal brief I ever submitted, every injunction, every habeas corpus petition. Back when I defended citizens in Bowie County, earning a mere $45,000 annually, operating out of a cinder block room with a collapsible desk, I constructed my own legal arguments. Because an attorney who duplicates a peer's brief and claims it as their own faces, disbarment. That is the definition of intellectual theft in the legal realm. And plagiarism, whether it involves a political monologue or a youth safety brochure, signifies a very fundamental truth. You possess absolutely zero original insights to share, forcing you to hijack another's vocabulary to mask the void. Mrs. Trump, your entire legacy is constructed upon silence. And this evening, we have discovered that this silence is not merely a tactical maneuver. It is an absolute necessity. Because on the rare occasions you do articulate, when your signature does validate text, the text inherently belongs to a third party. Melania's frame sank backward an additional inch. Her flawless spinal column had now retreated 2 full inches from its original rigid state. On an individual whose entire societal standing relied upon visual perfection, a 2-inch deviation was as glaring as a fracture in a marble statue. The fracture was expanding, not strictly due to Crockett's aggression, but because the compiled evidence was incredibly dense and her back had been supporting the weight of it all, the cryptocurrency, the coat, the audio clip, the manual, the address, without relief for an hour and a half. Even the most disciplined frameworks possess thresholds. Mrs. Trump. In August of 2025, Hunter Biden publicly alleged that Jeffrey Epstein facilitated the introduction between you and your current spouse. The atmosphere transformed. The oxygen shifted. The intense focus of the 200 occupants transitioned from bureaucratic fascination to something far more primal, akin to the visceral anticipation a courtroom exudes when the prosecuting attorney invokes the accused, the moniker, for the first time. You promised to litigate against him for $1 billion. She held up a media snippet confirming the declaration from Melania's spokespeople regarding the massive lawsuit threat. Mrs. Trump, did you ever initiate that legal action? The counsel leaned aggressively forward. It was his tightest encroachment yet, his shoulder practically grazing hers. It was the physical desperation of an attorney, recognizing that the ensuing 30 seconds would dictate the legacy of the entire proceeding. This issue is currently being managed by Mrs. Trump's independent. It requires a simple, affirmative, or negative counselor. Did she file the paperwork? Utter silence. Melania's digits, currently locked in their third distinct clench of the event, squeezed tighter. The fingertips of her dominant hand dug into the flesh of the subordinate hand. It was no longer a grasp. It was an indention, akin to how a victim applies pressure to a laceration, not to cure it, but to prevent the internal contents from bleeding out. The reality is negative. You never filed the paperwork. You issued $1 billion ultimatum, yet you never followed through. She elevated another file, this one boasting legal firm branding. It bore the distinct layout of confidential attorney-client correspondence. This constitutes a litigation hazard evaluation drafted by your personal lawyers in September 2025, secured via this committee's subpoena powers. She recited the text. Proceeding with litigation would activate discovery mandates, encompassing but not restricted to sworn testimony from Mrs. Trump concerning the specifics of her introduction to Mr. Trump, the turnover of all correspondence, itineraries, and transit logs from the period of 1998 through 2001, and the likely subpoenaing of external parties linked to Mr. Epstein's social web. She flipped to the subsequent page, and the ultimate advisory summary: advise against filing. The public ultimatum is adequate to secure a dissuasive impact without subjecting the client to discovery hazards. She deposited the assessment onto the pile. It rested alongside the financial filings, the photograph of the coat, the DHS border brief, the Wolkoff audio log, the duplicated pamphlets, the revision history, and the class action complaint. The platform was now heavily populated with 9 separate files, each tethered to Melania's identity, her authority, her vocals, or her finances, without subjecting the client to discovery hazards. Mrs. Trump, I have initiated lawsuits. I have fought them. I comprehend exactly what a discovery hazard entails. It signifies that there exists documentation or sworn testimony that, if brought to light, would inflict greater damage upon the client than any financial compensation the lawsuit could potentially yield. $1 billion was insufficient to justify the peril of answering inquiries regarding the year 1998. She allowed the statement to reverberate. A singular, devastating claim in a chamber containing 9 damning exhibits where the former First Lady's fingers finally unclasped and her attorney ceased his forward lean because there remained no defensible position to lean into. Mrs. Trump, I intend to pose the exact inquiry your legal team instructed you to dodge. What transpired in the year 1998? The room plunged into absolute stasis. Not mere committee room stasis, but courtroom stasis. The profound paralysis that erupts when a litigator finally asks the ultimate question that the entire proceeding has been methodically building toward. The singular question that every piece of evidence, every sworn individual, and every paper trail has been laying the groundwork for. In 1998, per public documentation, you relocated to Manhattan. You were a 28-year-old fashion model from Slovenia, and shortly thereafter, you were acquainted with Donald Trump. Hunter Biden asserted that Jeffrey Epstein orchestrated that meeting. You retaliated by threatening a $1 billion defamation suit. However, your counsel urged you to abandon the suit because proceeding would compel you to respond to interrogations regarding that initial meeting, regarding your correspondence spanning from 1998 to 2001, regarding flight manifests, and regarding what your own attorneys referred to as Mr. Epstein's social web. $1 billion, Mrs. Trump, that was the magnitude of your threat. And the threat was a hollow charade, because answering questions under penalty of perjury regarding 1998 was to quote your own attorneys, a hazard you were incapable of absorbing. I have practiced law for 16 years. I understand the definition of discovery hazard. It implies that unearthing the truth would be far more catastrophic than losing the case. It screams, do not unlock this vault, because the horrors inside vastly outweigh the horrors outside. What exactly is concealed inside that vault, Mrs. Trump? Melania's visage, the face that had initially been stoic, then strained, then forcefully stoic, then fatigued, morphed one final time. The immense exertion required to anchor her expression, the clenching of the jawbone, the flexing at the temples, the weaponized emptiness that had demanded exponentially more stamina across 4 relentless barrages of evidence, and her own leaked audio finally breached its threshold. It wasn't a theatrical breakdown. It was akin to a mechanical failure, not an explosion, but a quiet cessation of operations. The facial muscles dedicated to sustaining the neutral mask simply exhausted their energetic reserves. And the genuine countenance underneath finally emerged. It was not furious, not sorrowful, not explicitly remorseful. It was utterly exhausted. It was the face of an individual who had aggressively feigned tranquility for 20 solid years, and who had, within this very chamber, crushed beneath the weight of this undeniable paper trail, hit the absolute boundary of what fabricated tranquility could endure. The visage appeared significantly older than the one that had initially breached the doorway, not due to rapid aging, but because it laid bare the contrast between a facade that appears flawless due to meticulous polishing and a facade that appears flawless merely because the illumination is flattering. The illumination had radically shifted, and the exterior, stripped of its performative polish, revealed exactly what exteriors reveal when the upkeep stops. The passage of time, extreme exertion, and the immense psychological toll of 2 decades of aggressive muteness. Her palms rested limply at her flanks, unclasped, uncurled, unperforming. They were the hands of someone who had abandoned her sole defensive posture, because maintaining it required vitality, and her vitality was thoroughly depleted. Mrs. Trump, you have vocalized fewer phrases in the public square than any first lady in contemporary memory. Crockett's concluding monologue was subdued, not the subdued nature of holding back, but the subdued nature of finality. It was the cadence of a litigator who has arranged every final exhibit and is delivering her ultimate plea to the jurors. You forged a massive empire on muteness, on physically standing adjacent to authority while contributing 0 syllables, on permitting your silence to execute the dirty work that spoken dialogue would otherwise entangle. However, silence does not equate to exoneration. And this evening, we have uncovered precisely what your silence was shielding. A cryptocurrency scheme that funneled $24.7 million into your private coffers, while amateur traders were wiped out by 98%. A garment your personnel begged you to discard, which you flaunted anyway to inspect minors ripped from their families. An audio tape wherein you demanded, "Give me a fucking break," regarding those exact minors. A flagship societal program lifted verbatim from the preceding Obama administration. And a $1 billion legal ultimatum you brandished, but ultimately tucked away, because executing it would compel you to clarify how exactly you were introduced to your spouse. I served as a public defender, Mrs. Trump. I earned a meager $45,000 annually. My patrons lacked the capital to afford muteness. They lacked the resources for legal counsel who could lean forward and whisper into their ears. They were forced to sit inside judicial chambers and respond to interrogations under the threat of perjury. Muteness is an extravagance. It is arguably the most exorbitant extravagance in the United States. It requires $24.7 million in crypto liquidation. It requires a coat that advertises, "I don't care." It requires a $1 billion smokescreen to dodge inquiries concerning Jeffrey Epstein. My impoverished patrons in Bowie County could never dream of affording that extravagance. The 2,300 youth severed from their parents could never afford it. You possess the means for 2 decades, but muteness is only effective when nobody dares to raise a question. This evening, I raised the questions, and the paperwork provided the answers. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally accepted the referral roughly 48 hours later. Crockett's investigative body handed over the ethics disclosure detailing the $24.7 million moved from Melania Meme LLC, along with the bubble maps tracking and the civil lawsuit documentation. The formal referral questioned if the First Lady's fiscal maneuvers met the criteria for complicity in a securities manipulation racket, precisely as outlined by the claimants in the Southern District of New York. The SEC publicly confirmed intake. The dollar Melania token plunged an extra 40% in the 48 hours succeeding the testimony, diving from 15 cents down to 9. The congressional event had morphed into a Wall Street catalyst. Patricia's initial $3,200, which had already dwindled to $64 prior to the proceedings, now sat at a pitiful $38. Yet the First Lady's Truth Social update remained active. It's still broadcasted. You can buy Dollar Melania now. It remained live, actively urging followers to purchase a digital asset that had hemorrhaged 99.7% of its total value. The Federal Trade Commission released a public declaration. It consisted of 3 succinct sentences, brutal in their diplomatic restraint. The Commission's instructional literature resides within the public domain and is accessible for general utilization. We advocate for appropriate credit when federal assets are repurposed by external parties. The Commission holds no stance regarding the validity of any single individual's application of these assets. The Federal Bureau, whose documentation had been rebranded, was openly chastising the former First Lady without directly naming her. The FTC didn't have to explicitly name her. The revision log Control H, replacing FTC with Melania Trump, was now permanently enshrined in the congressional archives. Pro-immigration coalitions RACES, the ACLU, and the Florence Project submitted a collaborative amicus brief into active family separation lawsuits, leveraging the DHS border brief. The East Wing was provided an exhaustive summary regarding family dislocation 3 weeks prior to the First Lady's border tour. The First Lady's outward assertion of being caught unawares is directly refuted by the tangible evidence. The dossier 3 weeks prior, 2,300 youths. Family unit separation, explicitly in the header, now served as admissible proof in federal litigation. The snapshot of the coat was formally logged as an evidentiary exhibit. Hunter Biden's legal representative released a singular cutting sentence. We eagerly anticipate any legal action the First Lady desires to initiate, and we enthusiastically look forward to the discovery phase. A single sentence, no further context was necessary. Discovery phase, especially after Crockett had broadcasted the attorney's risk assessment urging her to avoid it, had transcended its status as mere legal jargon. It was a blatant challenge. And that challenge would remain permanently lodged in the public ledger, right next to the lawyer's guidance that explicitly warned, do not file. 2 distinct pieces of evidence that collectively painted a portrait of a billion-dollar bluff, thoroughly dismantled by a single sentence. Her autobiography, Melania, distributed in October 2024 and hitting bestseller lists, underwent rigorous digital scrutiny. Less than a week post-hearing, a textual researcher flagged 3 segments bearing profound structural echoes to a 2019 Vogue dialogue featuring the spouse of a European envoy, alongside 2 sections that heavily mimicked a 2021 Harper's Bazaar profile on an alternative fashion model. The publishing house remained tight-lipped, but the precedent Crockett had cemented stealing another's terminology and affixing your signature to it had mutated into a magnifying glass. And beneath that magnifying glass, every single paragraph Melania had ever authorized was now subjected to intense dissection. Melania's digital presence went utterly dormant. 0 updates. The very channel that had broadcasted Dollar Melania now to massive crowds ceased operations. It was the exact same muteness that had originally defined her persona, but it now telegraphed an entirely different message. Prior to the inquiry, her silence projected enigma, grace, and dominance. Following the inquiry, her silence screamed avoidance. Each 2 4-hour cycle without a digital update was another cycle where the financial records, the Wolkoff audio, the DHS brief, and the legal memo sat uncontested. Her silence had functioned as her shield. Now, her silence functioned as her confession. The Be Best web portal was deactivated. There was no public notice, no digital redirect. The web address simply failed to load. The overarching campaign that had operated as the First Lady's defining initiative constructed atop stolen literature and debuted mere weeks before she declared, "Give me a fucking break," was wiped from the digital sphere the exact same manner it was birthed. Devoid of justification, devoid of unique substance, and devoid of a single authentic concept that belonged to her. Donald Trump was pressed about the congressional inquiry. Melania is a fantastic individual, immensely graceful, immensely guarded. She detests this kind of circus. He notably omitted any reference to the meme cryptocurrency. He refused to dispute the ethics disclosure. He sidestepped the coat, the audio clip, the legal risk assessment, and the events of 1998 entirely. Detest this kind of circus emanating from a figure who fiercely shields his inner circle with cries of partisan witch hunt and total hoax, and the most severe persecution in human history hardly registered as a defense. It represented a total void of defense, and such a void coming from an individual who never fails to retaliate when his prized assets are under fire communicated volumes more than any social media rant could. And the ultimate query, what truly transpired in 1998, persisted. It lived not merely in news chyrons, but embedded securely within the congressional logs, destined to remain unresolved for as long as historical records are maintained. It remained unresolved because the subject of the inquiry had been explicitly advised by her own legal team that divulging the truth under oath during the discovery phase, surrendering communications and travel itineraries spanning from 1998 to 2001 was a fate far worse than abandoning a billion-dollar lawsuit. And any question deemed that costly to confront is a question where the actual truth carries an astronomically higher price tag than the act of dodging it. 3 million citizens absorbed the question. The question remains unanswered. Give me a fucking break. Those were Melania Trump's literal remarks concerning undocumented youth torn from their families, captured by a confidant, and replayed in a government oversight chamber where 9 damning pieces of paper bearing her identity already blanketed the dais. Yet, the audio clip wasn't the most horrific piece of evidence presented that evening. The most horrific was the ethics disclosure. $24.7 million extracted from a digital coin that tanked 98%. Capital that migrated from the depleted accounts of amateur traders straight into the First Lady's private vault as the market collapsed. The civil lawsuit labels it a pump and dump scheme. The ethics disclosure meticulously maps where the pump ultimately landed. The runner-up for the most horrific evidence was the DHS brief, distributed to the East Wing 3 weeks prior to the jacket stunt, 2,300 youths. Family unit separation spelled out in the title. The First Lady insisted she was totally oblivious. The brief proved she was thoroughly educated. The third most horrific item was the attorney's risk assessment. Advise against filing, discovery hazard, a massive billion-dollar intimidation tactic that never materialized into actual litigation because moving forward would force the First Lady to testify under penalty of perjury regarding 1998, regarding the orchestrator of her marriage, and regarding the dark truths discovery would unearth. The SEC is reviewing the complaint. The civil suit is advancing in the Southern District. The DHS brief is entered into federal litigation. The risk assessment is immortalized in congressional transcripts. The Wolkoff tape is permanently etched into the digital ether. Melania Trump forged a 2-decade reign entirely upon muteness, upon sharing proximity to immense influence while contributing nothing, upon allowing total verbal absence to serve as a blanket rebuttal to all inquiries. This evening, Jasmine Crockett posed the inquiries. In the paperwork, 9 distinct files, each tethered to the First Lady's identity. Her authority, her vocals, or her finances provided the explicit answers. Muteness served as her aesthetic. Muteness served as her tactic. Muteness translated to a $24.7 million payout, an insensitive garment, a billion-dollar facade, and 20 straight years of avoiding scrutiny. 3 million citizens witnessed that muteness shatter this evening. 3 million absorbed the audio tape. 3 million processed the ethics disclosure. 3 million registered the devastating inquiry regarding 1,998. 30 million is the threshold where the SEC pivots from mere review to aggressive investigation. It is the threshold where civil litigation transitions from a filing to a massive settlement. It is the threshold where the truth of what unfolded in 1998 migrates from a government oversight desk into a sworn deposition booth. The gap separating 3 million from 30 million is the precise gap separating muteness from accountability. Melania Trump has banked on that protective gap holding strong for 20 consecutive years. Tonight, that gap rapidly condensed.